Hi everyone, I'm a 27-year-old guy, and I think I've officially hit my breaking point when it comes to my family. For as long as I can remember, I've been compared to my cousin Emily. She's 29, and if you met her, you'd probably think she's perfect too. Emily is the kind of person who seems to have everything figured out. She's brilliant, charming, and ridiculously successful. And while I've been struggling to carve out my own place in life, she's been the family's golden child. This story isn't really about hating Emily. Honestly, she's fine. The problem is how my family has spent my entire life putting her on a pedestal and using her as a measuring stick for me. I'm finally at a point where I've realized I can't keep living like this. Here's what happened. Growing up, I didn't think much about the comparisons at first. Emily and I were close as kids. She was always the older cousin I looked up to. She got straight A's, played the violin, and seemed to be good at literally everything. Meanwhile, I was just me. I liked drawing and playing video games. I wasn't a bad student, but I wasn't winning any academic awards either. Things started getting weird around middle school. I remember one time I entered a local art contest and won first place. I was so proud, and when I showed my parents, they were happy until someone brought up that Emily had won a regional science fair the year before. Suddenly, my big moment didn't feel so big anymore. My parents weren't trying to be mean, but it was like everything I did had to be put into the context of what Emily had already done, and done better. This dynamic played out over and over. At family gatherings, the adults couldn't stop talking about Emily. She got into an Ivy League school? Amazing. Landed a six-figure job right after graduation? Unbelievable. Meanwhile, I was just trying to survive community college after switching majors 3 times. Even my siblings joined in, joking that I should take notes from her. They didn't mean any harm, but it stung. I started avoiding things I wasn't already good at because I didn't want to fail and give people more reasons to compare me to her. If I couldn't be the best, what was the point? That mindset followed me into adulthood, and let's just say it didn't do me any favors. I ended up with a pretty average academic record and an okay job, not bad, but nothing that would ever get the same kind of attention Emily's achievements did. The most recent blow came a few weeks ago. Emily got some big award at work, and my family threw her a huge dinner to celebrate. I went because, well, you kind of have to show up to these things. I was already feeling awkward because I just started a new job, and it wasn't anything glamorous. During the dinner, one of my uncles made a joke about how Emily could give me some career advice. Everyone laughed, and I tried to laugh too, but inside I was fuming. It wasn't even what he said, it was how natural it felt for everyone to assume she was the standard I should aspire to. The breaking point came later that night. After dinner, we had a family game night, and it was fine at first. Then someone asked a trivia question that I knew the answer to, but Emily got to it first. Cue the chorus of wow, she's so smart. And of course Emily would know that. I sat there silently, pretending it didn't bother me, but something in me snapped. I realized I couldn't keep doing this. The constant comparisons, the subtle jabs, the way my own family made me feel small, it wasn't just hurting me, it was holding me back. I needed to take control of my life and stop letting their opinions define me. That night I went home and started making a plan. The first step was therapy. A friend had been encouraging me to try it for a while, and I finally caved. In my first session, I unloaded everything about my family, Emily, and how all of it had shaped the way I saw myself. My therapist suggested I set some boundaries, especially with my parents. That idea terrified me, but I knew it had to be done. I sat them down a few days later and explained how all the comparisons had affected me. I told them I didn't blame Emily and that this wasn't about her, it was about how they treated me. They didn't take it well. My mom said I was being too sensitive, and my dad called it harmless joking. I tried to stand my ground, but it felt like talking to a brick wall. Still, I wasn't going to let that stop me. If they couldn't respect my boundaries, I'd just have to enforce them myself. I started focusing on things I actually enjoyed, like photography. It wasn't about being the best, it was about finding something that made me happy. Around the same time, I had a big win at work. I spearheaded a project that went way better than expected, and for the first time in years, I felt proud of myself, not because anyone else said I should be, but because I genuinely was. That brings me to now. After years of feeling overshadowed and overlooked, I've decided to stop chasing my family's approval. I want to be proud of who I am, not who they think I should be. Writing this post feels like the first step in that process. I'm not sure where this journey will take me, but I'm finally ready to find out. Update 1. After my last post, I decided to make some big changes in how I deal with my family. Therapy was helping me understand that the constant comparisons weren't just annoying, they were toxic. My therapist encouraged me to focus on setting boundaries, which I did. But what happened next completely blindsided me. It started with a family dinner. My parents must have been feeling some type of way about the conversation we'd had because they decided to bring it up right in front of everyone. I wasn't there. I deliberately skipped this gathering, but I heard all about it afterward. According to my sister, my mom casually mentioned that I'd been feeling a little sensitive lately about how much they talk about Emily. My dad chimed in, saying it was all just harmless fun and that I needed to lighten up. Of course, this opened the floodgates. Some of my relatives thought it was hilarious, cracking jokes about how I must be jealous of Emily. Others took it more seriously, acting shocked that I'd been harboring these feelings for so long. One of my aunts even said something along the lines of, well, we didn't realize he was so insecure. When my sister told me all this later, I couldn't believe it. I'd had a private conversation with my parents about something deeply personal, and they turned it into dinner table gossip. I was furious but decided not to confront them right away. Instead, I stayed quiet and let them come to me, which didn't take long. The next day, Emily reached out. She called me out of the blue, saying she'd heard about what happened. She sounded genuinely apologetic, saying she never wanted to overshadow me and didn't realize how much the comparisons bothered me. She even admitted that it wasn't always easy for her either, that being the golden child came with its own pressures. Her words caught me off guard. I'd spent so much time resenting her that I never considered she might have her own struggles. But at the same time, I wasn't sure if she really understood what it felt like to always be in her shadow. I thanked her for reaching out but didn't say much else. I needed time to process what she'd said. Back in therapy, my therapist encouraged me to focus on my own growth rather than getting stuck in how others perceive me. I liked that idea, but it was easier said than done, especially when my family wasn't making things any easier. I made a bold decision to skip the next big family gathering, a birthday party for one of my cousins. I didn't make a big announcement about it. I just let my parents know I wouldn't be attending. As expected, they didn't take it well. My mom accused me of being dramatic, and my dad said I was hurting the family by refusing to participate. I calmly told them I wasn't avoiding anyone, but I needed some space to focus on myself. That didn't go over well, but I stuck to my guns. During this time, I kept posting on Reddit. To my surprise, my initial post started gaining traction. Hundreds of people chimed in with supportive comments and advice, validating what I was going through. Some even shared their own stories about being compared to siblings or cousins, which made me feel less alone. One comment, in particular, stood out. The person speculated that Emily might have been under just as much pressure as I was, but in a different way. That really made me think. Maybe this wasn't just about me versus Emily. Maybe it was about the unhealthy dynamics in our entire family. Meanwhile, things at work were looking up. I'd been working hard on a project for weeks, and it finally paid off when I got an unexpected promotion. For once, I felt like I'd achieved something entirely on my own. I shared the news with a few close friends and posted about it on my personal social media, but I didn't tell my family. I wasn't trying to hide it, I just didn't want to deal with their reactions. Of course, that didn't last long. My mom found out about the promotion through a distant relative who'd seen my post. She called me immediately, acting hurt that I hadn't told her. I calmly explained that I wanted to celebrate my success without the constant comparisons. She didn't take it well, accusing me of keeping secrets and punishing the family for things that weren't intentional. At this point, I was done trying to explain myself. I told her that I wasn't withholding anything, I was just prioritizing my own happiness for once. That seemed to shut her down, at least temporarily. The most surprising development came from my younger sister. She started reaching out more, asking how I was doing and even admitting that she'd never realized how much the comparisons bothered me. She apologized for the time she'd teased me about Emily and said she wanted to be more supportive. It felt like a small victory in the middle of all the chaos. But not everyone was as understanding. One of my cousins posted a thinly veiled jab in the family group chat, saying something about people who can't handle a little family banter. I didn't respond. Instead, I muted the chat and moved on. I'm learning that not every battle is worth fighting. For now, I'm focusing on work, therapy, and my hobbies. The situation with my family is still messy, but I'm starting to see glimpses of progress. If nothing else, I'm learning to stand up for myself, and that feels like a win. Update 2. A few days after my last update, something unexpected happened. Emily reached out again. This time, it wasn't just a quick apology or a vague acknowledgement of the family dynamics. It was a real conversation. She wanted to meet up, so we grabbed coffee at a quiet cafe. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I definitely didn't expect what she told me. Emily opened up about how much pressure she's been under all these years. She said the pedestal our family put her on wasn't as glamorous as it seemed. Every achievement felt like another thing she had to top, and the constant praise didn't always feel good. She even admitted that there were times she wished she could just be normal, without the family constantly expecting her to be perfect. Hearing this was surprising, to say the least. I never really thought about what it might feel like for her. For the first time, we talked openly about the comparisons and how they affected both of us. She apologized again for any role she might have played, and this time it felt more genuine. We agreed that our family's obsession with putting people into categories golden child, black sheep, etc. was toxic. Emily even admitted that she envied how I got to pursue my own path without everyone scrutinizing my every move. It was eye-opening to realize that, in her own way, Emily felt just as trapped by the family dynamics as I did. We decided to approach the next family gathering as a team. Emily suggested bringing up the issue with everyone, not in an aggressive way, but just to make them aware of how their words and actions had impacted us. I wasn't sure how that would go, but I appreciated her willingness to try. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A few days later, there was another family dinner. I wasn't planning to go, but after my conversation with Emily, I decided to give it a shot. If she was willing to stand up to the family, the least I could do was back her up. Dinner started off the way it always does, small talk, a few harmless jokes, and then like clockwork, someone brought up one of Emily's recent achievements. This time, instead of letting it slide, Emily gently interrupted. She said she appreciated the support, but felt it was important to address something that had been bothering her for a while. You could have heard a pin drop. Emily explained how the constant comparisons weren't just unfair to me, but also to her. She pointed out that it put unnecessary pressure on everyone involved and made family gatherings feel more like competitions than celebrations. Some of the older relatives looked uncomfortable, while others outright dismissed what she was saying. One aunt laughed it off, saying, "Oh, come on, it's just harmless fun. You two are overthinking this." My parents, predictably, got defensive. My mom insisted that they've always been fair and supportive, while my dad claimed I was imagining things and blowing everything out of proportion. Emily didn't back down, though. She calmly explained that whether or not they intended to hurt anyone, their words and actions had consequences. For the first time, I saw my cousin, the golden child, use her position to defend me. It felt surreal. To my surprise, my younger sister chimed in. She backed me up, saying that the comparisons were real and that she'd seen how they affected me over the years. Her support added weight to Emily's argument, and some of the other relatives started nodding along. It wasn't a total victory, but it was a start. For once, the spotlight wasn't entirely on Emily, it was on the issue at hand. After the dinner, I started making more deliberate choices about how I spent my time. Work was going well, but I didn't want it to consume me. I picked up photography again, this time with the goal of building a portfolio. I also started sharing more of my personal milestones online, like a photo I took that got featured in a local magazine. The response was overwhelming, with people from my online community cheering me on. It felt good to be recognized for something I cared about. Back on Reddit, I received a private message from someone who had read my posts. They shared their own experience with family comparisons and how they'd spent years seeking validation from people who would never give it. Their story hit close to home and made me think about my own patterns. Was I still looking for approval from my family, even after everything? In therapy, I brought this up. My therapist pointed out how much progress I'd made in building my confidence and self-expression. They encouraged me to keep focusing on my own growth instead of trying to change my family. It felt like a breakthrough moment. Things with my parents, however, were still rocky. A few days after the dinner, they sat me down and told me I needed to stop making waves or risk alienating the family. It wasn't exactly an ultimatum, but it felt like one. I told them I wasn't trying to cause drama, I just wanted to create a healthier dynamic for everyone. They didn't seem convinced. Emily, true to her word, tried to mediate. She had a private conversation with my parents, explaining that she agreed with me and thought the family needed to change. Unfortunately, it didn't go well. My parents dismissed her concerns, claiming she was being influenced by me. It was frustrating, but Emily reassured me that she wasn't giving up. Meanwhile, the extended family was starting to notice the tension. A few relatives reached out, asking what was going on. I kept my responses neutral, calmly explaining my side of the story without bad-mouthing anyone. It wasn't easy, but I didn't want to add fuel to the fire. For now, I'm taking things one step at a time. The family dynamic is far from perfect, but I'm starting to see small cracks in the old patterns. Whether or not they're ready to change, I know I'm moving in the right direction. Update 3. The family drama didn't stay quiet for long. After Emily and I joined forces at the last family dinner, the tension seemed to simmer down, but only on the surface. Behind the scenes, things were bubbling over, and it didn't take long for the next big twist to shake things up. It started during a casual phone call with my aunt, the one who tends to know all the family gossip. She called to check in after hearing about some of the recent family drama, and during our chat, she let something slip. Apparently, my parents had gone through similar comparisons when they were younger. My dad's brother was the golden child back then, and my grandparents constantly pitted them against each other. My mom, on the other hand, grew up hearing about how her sister was the prettier and smarter one. Hearing this made everything click. It wasn't just about Emily and me, this was a cycle. My parents weren't just being unfair, they were projecting their own unresolved insecurities onto us. I couldn't believe I hadn't put it together sooner. I brought this up in therapy, and my therapist encouraged me to use this insight not to excuse their behavior but to understand where it was coming from. That made it easier to focus on healing for myself rather than trying to fix them. While I was piecing that together, Emily dropped a bombshell on the family. She was engaged. She announced it in our family group chat with a picture of the ring and a message that said she couldn't wait to celebrate with everyone. The chat exploded with congratulations, heart emojis, and plans for a big engagement party. Despite everything, I decided to attend. It wasn't about the family, it was about supporting Emily. She and I had built a new kind of bond, and I wanted to be there for her. The engagement party was held at a nice venue, and the whole family showed up dressed to the nines. From the moment I walked in, the energy was complicated. Some relatives greeted me warmly, while others gave me side-eye, probably still salty about the dinner confrontation. My parents were oddly cheerful toward me, which threw me off. They acted as if nothing had happened, asking about my work and even complimenting my outfit. It was strange, but I played along for the sake of keeping the peace. Toward the middle of the party, something unexpected happened. One of my uncles pulled me aside. He wasn't someone I interacted with much, but he surprised me by saying he admired how I'd stood up for myself at the last dinner. He shared that he'd experienced similar comparisons growing up and wished he'd had the courage to speak out. Hearing that felt like validation I didn't even know I needed. Maybe the cracks in the family dynamics were starting to spread wider than I thought. Emily was the star of the night, of course, but she made a point to include me. At one point, she introduced me to her fiancé's family, calling me her favorite cousin. It felt genuine, not like something she was saying for show. Later, she pulled me aside and thanked me again for standing by her. She even joked that I was the reason she had the confidence to speak up in the first place. It was a small moment, but it meant a lot. Outside of family drama, things in my life were starting to come together. Work was steady, and I was exploring a side hustle in photography. I got a couple of paid gigs and started building a portfolio. Sharing these wins on social media brought an outpouring of support, especially from people who'd followed my story on Reddit. My last post had gone viral, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of family pressure and comparisons. It was humbling and inspiring to know I wasn't alone. Back in therapy, I shifted my focus to forgiveness, not for my parents' sake, but for my own peace of mind. Letting go of the anger didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It just meant I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. Around the same time, my younger sister and I made a pact to have each other's backs at future family events. She'd been one of my biggest supporters recently, and it felt good to know I wasn't completely alone in this. Of course, my parents couldn't stay out of the drama for long. A few days after the engagement party, my dad called me and accused me of turning the family against them. He said my actions had caused a rift and that they felt like I was painting them as villains. I calmly reminded him that I'd only shared my truth and that any fallout was the result of their own actions, not mine. He wasn't happy with that answer, but I didn't let it escalate. Meanwhile, I was hitting a major milestone in my personal life. I bought my first home. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. Signing those papers felt like a symbol of independence, proof that I was building a life on my own terms, away from the family's expectations. I didn't tell anyone except my sister and Emily, who were both thrilled for me. To wrap this up, I'll leave you with a bit of a teaser. Let's just say there's a big change on the horizon, one that I think will shake up the family dynamics even more. I can't share details just yet, but stay tuned. Things are about to get interesting. Update 4. After months of back and forth tension with my family, I decided to accept an invitation to the annual family reunion. It wasn't an easy decision, but the constant nagging from my parents finally wore me down. Plus, I was curious to see how things would play out after everything that had happened. Would they acknowledge my boundaries? Would Emily and I still be on the same page? There was only one way to find out. The reunion was held at a community center, decked out with picnic tables, string lights, and a buffet that could feed an army. From the moment I arrived, I could feel the weight of 100 expectations. My parents were the first to greet me, their smiles just a little too wide. They asked about my new house, complimented my outfit, and even introduced me to a distant relative I barely remembered. On the surface, it looked like they were making an effort, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Things were fine at first. I stuck close to Emily, who had become my unofficial ally at these events. We chatted about her wedding plans, which seemed to be the main topic of conversation. Every so often, someone would bring up her latest accomplishment or gush about her fiancé, but Emily was quick to redirect the conversation, often turning the spotlight on me. It was subtle but effective. For once, I didn't feel like I was standing in her shadow, but of course it didn't last. At one point, my dad made an offhand comment about how I should take notes from Emily's career path. It was said in a lighthearted tone, but the meaning was clear. My mom chimed in, reminiscing about how Emily had always been so focused and driven since childhood. I could feel the familiar frustration building, but before I could respond, Emily stepped in. She smiled and casually mentioned my recent photography feature in a local magazine, calling it amazing and so creative. The shift was immediate. Suddenly, everyone at the table was asking me about my work, the feature, and whether I had more projects in the pipeline. Emily had effectively derailed the comparison train, and for the first time, I felt like my accomplishments were being seen. Later, I overheard a group of older relatives gossiping about me. They were speculating about why I didn't follow a more traditional career path and making veiled comments about my choices. Before I could decide whether to walk away or confront them, one of my younger cousins spoke up. She defended me, pointing out that I was clearly doing well and that it was outdated to judge someone for not fitting into a specific mold. Her words caught me off guard, but I felt a surge of gratitude. Maybe things were changing, one small step at a time. The highlight of the reunion came during dinner. My younger sister, who had been one of my biggest supporters lately, stood up and made an impromptu toast. She started by talking about the importance of family and then pivoted to my journey. She praised my resilience, creativity, and the way I was carving out a path for myself despite all the challenges. Her words brought a few relatives to tears, and for once, the spotlight wasn't on Emily, it was on me. I caught Emily's eye across the table, and she gave me a thumbs up. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. After dinner, my parents pulled me aside for a private conversation. My dad insisted they hadn't meant to offend me with their earlier comments and accused me of being too sensitive. My mom doubled down, saying they were just trying to motivate me. I pushed back, calmly but firmly, explaining how their words over the years had affected me and how I needed them to respect my boundaries. The conversation grew heated, with my dad accusing me of holding a grudge and refusing to let things go. When I brought this up in therapy later, my therapist reminded me of something we'd discussed before, focusing on repair instead of revenge. The goal wasn't to win the argument, but to create space for healthier dynamics. It wasn't easy, but I ended the conversation by reiterating my boundaries and walking away before things escalated further. Back on Reddit, I shared my experience, and one comment stood out. Someone suggested family therapy as a way to address the deeper issues. It wasn't a new idea, I'd thought about it before, but hearing it from someone else gave me the push I needed to bring it up with my parents. Predictably, they dismissed the idea, calling it unnecessary and a waste of money. I didn't press the issue, but I filed it away as something worth revisiting in the future. Emily, on the other hand, was all in. She offered to mediate a family conversation, saying she wanted to help bridge the gap. It was a generous offer, but I wasn't sure how effective it would be, especially with my parents' resistance. In the meantime, they began reaching out to other relatives, painting me as the one who couldn't move on. I heard about this through the grapevine but chose not to engage. I wasn't going to let them drag me back into the old patterns. Toward the end of the reunion, something surprising happened. My parents made an effort to engage with me in a positive way. My dad asked more thoughtful questions about my photography, and my mom expressed interest in one of my upcoming projects. It wasn't a complete turnaround, but it felt like a small step forward. Maybe they were starting to realize that change was possible, even if it was slow. For now, I'm holding on to that hopeful sign. The road ahead isn't easy, but I'm learning to stand firm in my boundaries while staying open to progress. One thing's for sure, this chapter is far from over. Update 5. After everything that's happened, I didn't expect things to take the turn they did. It feels like I'm finally stepping into a new chapter, one that doesn't revolve around old comparisons or family drama. But let me start from the beginning. A few weeks ago, I received an email that completely floored me. I'd won a prestigious award in my industry for a photography project I'd worked on for months. It was one of those moments where you have to reread the email 3 times to make sure it's real. For the first time, I felt like all the hard work I'd put into building my career and identity was paying off. Instead of rushing to tell my family, I kept the news to myself. I shared it with close friends and a few colleagues, who were all thrilled for me. I guess part of me didn't want to deal with the mixed reactions I'd learned to expect from my parents and extended family. I wasn't hiding it, I just wanted to enjoy the moment on my own terms. That didn't last long. A distant relative who'd seen the announcement online told my parents. A day later, I got a call from my mom, who was unusually excited. She congratulated me, going on about how proud they were. It was rare to hear such unfiltered enthusiasm from her, and for a moment it felt like a breakthrough. My dad even got on the phone to ask about the project, which caught me off guard. It seemed like for once they were celebrating my achievements without comparing me to anyone else. Meanwhile, Emily's wedding planning was in full swing. She called me one evening and asked if I could help her with some of the details, specifically the photography and creative aspects. It was clear she valued my input, and it felt good to be included in such a meaningful way. As we worked on the plans, I noticed how much closer we'd become. Emily went out of her way to make sure I felt appreciated, and I could tell she was making an effort to bridge the gap that had once been between us. At family gatherings, people started noticing too. There were whispers about how close Emily and I had gotten, with some relatives joking about our new alliance. I didn't care about the comments. If anything, they made me realize how far we'd come as cousins. In the midst of all this, my younger sister dropped a surprising revelation. Over coffee one weekend, she admitted that she'd been working behind the scenes to help our parents understand my perspective. She'd been sharing articles about toxic family dynamics and gently pointing out examples of their behavior. It wasn't something I'd asked her to do, but knowing she had my back meant the world. Therapy was also starting to feel like a real game changer. My therapist pointed out how much progress I'd made in letting go of old grudges and focusing on my own growth. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving family dynamics. I was thriving despite them. Around this time, I decided to write a letter to my parents. It wasn't easy, but I wanted to lay everything out, my experiences growing up, how the comparisons had affected me, and what I needed from them moving forward. I made sure the tone was honest but not accusatory. After all, this wasn't about blame, it was about healing. Their response surprised me. My dad called first, sounding a little defensive at first, but eventually acknowledged that they might not have realized how their actions affected me. My mom followed up with a long text, apologizing for some things but still insisting they meant well. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. Then came Emily's wedding day. It was a beautiful ceremony held at a vineyard with rolling hills and perfect weather. Watching her walk down the aisle, I felt genuinely happy for her, which was something I wasn't sure I'd ever feel. During the reception, Emily gave a speech that caught everyone off guard. She thanked her family for their support, but then shifted focus to me. She talked about how much she admired my strength and growth and how I'd inspired her to stand up for herself too. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the wedding, my parents pulled me aside for a private conversation. They admitted they'd been reflecting on their actions and wanted to do better. To my shock, they even agreed to try a few family therapy sessions. It wasn't something I'd expected, but it felt like a huge step forward. Since then, family gatherings have started to feel different. The comparisons that once dominated every conversation have faded, replaced by genuine interest in each other's lives. Emily and I continue to support each other, and my sister remains my biggest ally. Slowly but surely, the family dynamics are shifting. I shared this journey with Reddit, and the response has been overwhelming. My posts have resonated with so many people who faced similar struggles, and I'm grateful for the advice and encouragement I've received along the way. As for me, I'm finally in a place where I can look back and see how far I've come, not just in my relationships, but in finding my own identity and happiness. This isn't the end of the story, but it feels like the beginning of something new. Thank you all for being part of the journey. I've always known that my relationship with my older brother Daniel wasn't like most siblings. He was 3 years older than me, but it always felt like I was the older one. Growing up, my parents made it very clear Daniel could do no wrong. If he got into trouble at school, the teachers were too strict. If he failed a class, he just needed more time to figure things out. If he broke something at home, it was just an accident. Meanwhile, if I made a mistake, even a small one, I got a lecture about responsibility, about how I needed to be the dependable one. It didn't take me long to understand the unspoken rule in my family. Family comes first wasn't just a nice saying. It meant I had to sacrifice, so Daniel didn't have to. I learned to stop asking for things. I stopped expecting fairness. Instead, I focused on myself. I worked hard in school, got a decent job, and saved every penny I could. By the time I turned 30, I had done something I was truly proud of. I bought my own house. It wasn't a mansion or anything, but it was mine. A place I could finally call home. I didn't have to answer to anyone, didn't have to share my space, didn't have to clean up after someone else's mess. It felt like freedom. Daniel, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He never held on to a job for long, either quitting because he was bored or getting fired because he showed up late too many times. He spent money like it was nothing, new clothes, new gadgets, expensive nights out, and when he ran out of money, he just called our parents, and they always helped him. Always. I had no idea just how bad things had gotten for Daniel until the night he showed up at my door. I had just gotten home from work, tired and ready to relax, when I heard the doorbell. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I looked through the peephole, there he was, Daniel. I sighed before opening the door. "Hey," I said, trying to sound neutral. "Hey, man." He grinned, acting like this was just a casual visit. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. "Sure." He walked in like he owned the place, looking around as if he was inspecting it. "Wow, nice place," he said, nodding approvingly. "Thanks," I replied, shutting the door. "What's up?" he sighed, suddenly looking serious. "Look, I'll just get straight to the point. Rachel and I were in a bit of a tough spot. Rachel was his wife. I barely knew her because Daniel never really brought her around much." "What kind of tough spot?" I asked, already getting a bad feeling. He scratched the back of his head. "We got evicted from our place." I blinked. "Evicted?" "Yeah," he said quickly, as if hoping I wouldn't ask too many questions. "You know how it is. Rent's insane right now and things have been tight. We fell behind a bit, and the landlord wouldn't cut us any slack. So yeah, we had to leave." I folded my arms. "Where are you staying now?" "With a friend for now, but that's temporary." He looked me straight in the eyes. "That's actually why I'm here." I waited. "Mark, I need a place to stay." I let out a slow breath. I had a feeling this was coming, but I still wasn't ready for it. "For how long?" I asked carefully. He hesitated. "Well, not just for a little while." He smiled, like he was about to drop a great idea. I was thinking, "Why don't you just let us have the house?" I stared at him, thinking I must have misheard. "What?" He chuckled, as if this was no big deal. "Come on, man. You're doing well. You've got this whole place to yourself, and it's way more space than you need." Meanwhile, Rachel and I were having a baby. I blinked again. "A baby?" "Yeah," he grinned. "We just found out a few weeks ago. And man, we're gonna need a real home for the baby. Not just some tiny apartment, but a house. A place with space, you know?" He spread his arms, gesturing at my living room like he was already picturing his furniture in it. I shook my head, still trying to process what I was hearing. "Daniel, I worked for this house. I saved for years. Why would I just give it to you?" His smile faded, and he sighed, shaking his head like I was the one being difficult. "Because Mark, family comes first." I felt my jaw clench. I had heard those words my entire life, and I knew exactly what they meant. They meant that once again, I was supposed to sacrifice while Daniel got what he wanted. Only this time, I wasn't sure I was willing to play along. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Daniel, I understand that things are tough right now, but you're asking me to give you my house. Do you even realize what you're saying?" Daniel sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Mark, this isn't just about me. It's about my family. Rachel is pregnant, we're bringing a child into this world, and we need a stable place to live. A house. Not some tiny apartment where the baby won't even have a proper room." I crossed my arms. "You had a place, and you lost it. How did that happen?" He rubbed his face. "Man, you don't understand how hard it's been. Rent is crazy high these days. We fell behind a little, and the landlord just wouldn't work with us. We asked for more time, but he didn't care. Next thing we knew, we were out." I frowned. "You didn't have savings?" He laughed bitterly. "Savings? Mark, we were barely making ends meet. Rachel lost her job a few months ago, and well, things at work weren't exactly stable either. I already knew what that meant. Daniel had probably quit another job or gotten fired for showing up late too many times. It was always the same story. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said carefully. "But giving you my house isn't an option." Daniel threw up his hands. "Why not? You live here alone. You don't even need all this space. Rachel and I could actually use it. We're going to have a kid, man." I shook my head. "That's not the point, Daniel. This isn't about space. It's about the fact that I worked hard for this house. I spent years saving up for it. I made sacrifices. You've never been responsible with money. What happens if I give you the house? What if you can't afford the property taxes? The maintenance? Are you expecting me to pay for all of that too?" He scoffed. "Wow, so that's what you think of me? That I'm just some freeloader?" I didn't say anything because, honestly, that was exactly what I thought. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. "Mom." I sighed, already knowing why she was calling. "Let me guess," I said. "You already told Mom and Dad about this, didn't you?" Daniel shrugged. "They agree with me. They think you should help." I stared at him in disbelief. Of course they did. "Mark, you're doing so well," Mom's voice said the moment I picked up the call. "You have your own house. You have a good job. You don't have to worry about a wife or kids." But Daniel, he's struggling. And now, with a baby on the way, I cut her off. "Mom, I'm not giving him my house." "Who said anything about giving?" She said quickly. "You could just let them stay. You wouldn't even notice them there." I closed my eyes, trying to keep my patience. "Mom, it's not that simple." "Yes, it is," she insisted. "Daniel is your brother. You have a responsibility to help him." I gritted my teeth. Responsibility. That word again. It always meant the same thing. Daniel could make a mess, and I had to clean it up. "He and Rachel can find another rental," I said firmly. "Oh, come on, Mark," she sighed. "Rent is so expensive now. They've already been through so much." "Then they can find a smaller place," I countered. "You expect them to raise a baby in a tiny apartment?" She gasped, like I had suggested something cruel. "It's better than being homeless, isn't it?" I shot back. Silence. Then she changed tactics. "You have so much space, sweetheart. Why not share it? You wouldn't even feel the difference. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling my patience slipping. That's not the point, Mom. Then what is? She asked, voice rising. Why are you being so selfish? I clenched my jaw. Selfish? Yes, she snapped. Your brother is in trouble, and you're just watching him struggle. What kind of brother does that? I was done. I have to go, I said, and hung up. Daniel was watching me, arms crossed. So? I let out a slow breath. I can let you stay for a little while, I said finally. A few months, maybe. But only until you get back on your feet. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. No, man, that's not gonna work. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He leaned forward, placing his hands on the kitchen counter. Mark, I'm not looking for a temporary fix. I need a real home. A permanent one. I can't just move in and then have to leave again. That's not fair to Rachel. Or the baby. I stared at him. So, what? You expect me to move out of my own house? He looked at me, unblinking. I mean, yeah, it would make the most sense. I let out a dry laugh. Are you serious? Think about it, he said, like he was explaining something obvious. You don't even have kids. You don't need all this space. Meanwhile, I have a family now. This house would actually be useful for us. I could feel my hands shaking. Daniel, I bought this house. It's mine. He rolled his eyes. And what, you'd rather let your nephew grow up struggling than just do the right thing? I clenched my fists. I had spent years being told to put family first. Years being told that Daniel's needs mattered more than mine. Not this time. I'm not giving you my house, Daniel, I said firmly. His face darkened. So that's it? You're just gonna let us be homeless? I narrowed my eyes. No, I'm saying you need to take responsibility for your own life. He let out a bitter chuckle. Wow, you really are heartless, huh? I exhaled slowly. If you're looking for someone to take care of you, Daniel, you're going to have to find someone else. Because I'm done. I turned and walked to the door. Daniel stood there for a second, like he couldn't believe what was happening. Then, finally, he shook his head. You're gonna regret this, Mark. I opened the door. Good night, Daniel. He didn't move. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue again. But then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped outside. I shut the door behind him. Leaning against it, I let out a shaky breath. I had stood my ground. For once, I had said no, but something told me this wasn't over yet. The phone calls started the very next morning. I had barely opened my eyes when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I groaned, rolling over to check the screen. Mom. Again. I sighed. I already knew how this conversation was going to go, but I picked up anyway. Hello? Mark? Mom's voice came through loud and sharp. I cannot believe you turned your brother away last night. I rubbed my temple. Good morning to you too, Mom. Don't good morning me, she snapped. Your brother came to you in his time of need, and you shut the door in his face. Is that how you treat family? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't shut the door in his face. I told him he could stay temporarily until he got back on his feet. He's the one who refused. Because he needs more than just a few months, Mark. She huffed. He's about to be a father. Do you even understand what that means? I clenched my jaw. I do. And I understand that raising a kid comes with responsibility. Maybe if he had thought about that sooner, he wouldn't be in this situation. She gasped like I had just insulted her directly. How can you say that? He's your brother. You're supposed to help him, not lecture him. I sat up in bed, already feeling my patience slipping. Mom, I worked hard for this house. I saved for years. And now you're expecting me to just hand it over? Her tone turned sharp. You're doing well. You have a good job, no wife, no kids. Meanwhile, Daniel has a family to think about. I shook my head. So because I don't have kids, I don't deserve the house I bought? She let out a long sigh, like I was the one being difficult. That's not what I'm saying. But this is what family does, Mark. We help each other. If you were struggling, wouldn't you want your brother to help you? I almost laughed. The idea of Daniel helping me with anything was ridiculous. Mom, if I was struggling, I would figure it out. I wouldn't show up at someone's house and demand they give me everything they worked for. Silence. Then she spoke again, her voice softer. Mark, please. If not for Daniel, then for the baby. Your nephew. What kind of uncle would let his own nephew be homeless? And there it was. The guilt trip. The emotional manipulation. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. Mom, I said slowly, Daniel isn't homeless. He just doesn't want to take responsibility. He and Rachel could find a rental if they really wanted to. They just don't want to live within their means. Living in a tiny apartment isn't good for a child, she argued. It's better than living off someone else, I shot back. Her voice grew cold. I hope you can live with yourself, Mark. Then she hung up. I sighed, tossing my phone onto the bed. It wasn't even 8 a.m. and I already had a headache. The calls didn't stop. Every day, my parents took turns trying to break me down. Some calls were full of anger, others were filled with disappointment. My dad tried the logical approach, saying things like, you have a great job, Mark. Buying another house wouldn't be that hard for you. Meanwhile, Daniel and Rachel started their own campaign. I got texts from Rachel, messages full of guilt. I just don't understand how you could do this to your own family. I thought you would be happy for us, but instead you're turning your back on your own nephew before he's even born. Mark, do you really want your nephew to grow up knowing his uncle abandoned him? Daniel, on the other hand, was more direct. Hope you're happy sitting alone in that big empty house while your brother has nowhere to go. You're choosing a house over your own family. How selfish can you be? I ignored most of it, but the pressure never stopped. Then came the family dinner. I should have known it was a setup. Mom invited me over, acting like it was just a casual get-together. We haven't all sat down together in a while, she said sweetly. Come have dinner with us? I was hesitant, but I figured if I didn't show up, I'd never hear the end of it. Big mistake. The moment I stepped into the dining room, I knew exactly what was happening. Daniel and Rachel were already seated, looking smug. My dad sat at the head of the table, arms crossed. Mom was in the kitchen, bringing out food like everything was normal. I sat down cautiously. We barely got through 5 minutes of small talk before Mom started. Mark, she said, placing a bowl of mashed potatoes in front of me. Have you thought any more about helping your brother? I sighed. Mom, we're not doing this here. Dad spoke up. Mark, your brother is struggling. You have the ability to help him. So why won't you? I dropped my fork. Because it's my house. Because I worked for it. Because I am tired of being expected to fix Daniel's problems. Rachel gasped. Fix his problems? Wow. I didn't realize being there for family was such a burden for you. Daniel shook his head. I can't believe you're doing this, man. I thought we were brothers. We are, I said, my voice tight. But that doesn't mean I have to give you everything I have. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. I just don't understand how my own son can be so cold. I clenched my fists. No, what's cold is expecting me to give up the home I built for myself just because Daniel refuses to be responsible. That's when Daniel snapped. You know what? He shouted, shoving his chair back. You're a selfish, heartless jerk, Mark. You don't care about anyone but yourself. I stared at him, completely done. I care about myself for once. And that's the problem, isn't it? You don't like that I finally said no. He glared at me, his face red with anger. You're gonna regret this. I stood up. No, Daniel, you are. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the house. I didn't even feel bad. For the first time in my life, I wasn't playing the role they expected me to play, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. I thought things couldn't get worse after that family dinner. I was wrong. A few days later, I pulled into my driveway after a long day at work, looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening alone. But the moment I stepped out of my car, I froze. Daniel and Rachel were standing on my front porch, with moving boxes. I stared at them, my heart sinking. Rachel was holding a box labeled baby stuff in thick black marker, while Daniel leaned casually against a pile of luggage. What is this? I asked, already feeling anger bubbling inside me. Daniel grinned like this was the best surprise ever. Mom said you'd come around, so we decided to get a head start. Then, as if he had every right to, he grabbed one of the boxes and pushed past me toward the door. That's when I snapped. No, I said, my voice sharp. No, you are not moving in. Daniel stopped mid-step and turned to look at me like I had just spoken a different language. What do you mean? Mom said. I don't care what Mom said, I cut him off. This is my house. And I did not agree to this. Rachel's mouth fell open. Mark, are you serious right now? I let out a dry laugh. Dead serious. What made you think you could just show up here with your stuff and move in? Daniel scoffed. Mom said you were just being stubborn. She told us to give you some time to come to your senses. We figured it'd be easier if we just know, I said again, stepping between him and the door. You are not moving in. Not today. Not ever. Rachel let out a dramatic gasp, clutching her belly as if I had physically shoved her. How can you do this to your own nephew? I narrowed my eyes. Rachel, he's not even born yet. Her face crumpled, and just like that, the waterworks started. She burst into tears, shaking her head like I had just kicked a puppy. You're a monster, she sobbed. I sighed. Rachel, crying isn't going to change anything. But she kept going, loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. Daniel, on the other hand, was no longer trying to play nice. His face twisted in anger, and he stepped toward me aggressively. I cannot believe you, he said, his voice shaking with rage. You're actually choosing a house over your own family. I clenched my fists. No, Daniel, I'm choosing myself for once. Something you never seem to do. His hands balled into fists. You're a disgrace to this family, you know that? I let out a bitter chuckle. Funny, I was about to say the same about you. Rachel's crying grew louder. We have nowhere to go, Mark. We're going to be homeless, all because of you. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my patience. You are not homeless. You just don't want to take responsibility for your own life. There are rentals available. You could find something you can afford. But instead you're here, trying to take the easy way out. Daniel shook his head, laughing bitterly. You really don't care, do you? Not anymore, I admitted. Before he could say anything else, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I already knew who it was. Mom. I picked up, not even waiting for her to speak. Let me guess. You sent them here, didn't you? Mark, she started, her voice dripping with disappointment. Why are you making this so difficult? I scoffed. Difficult. Mom, they showed up at my house with moving boxes without my permission. Because we knew you'd fight it. She snapped. You're just being stubborn, Mark. Why can't you just be a good brother and do the right thing? I clenched my jaw. Mom, if you care so much, why don't you take them in? Silence. I could hear her breathing on the other end, but she didn't say anything. Well, I pressed. You spent weeks telling me it's my responsibility, so why not yours? Finally, she spoke, but her voice was shaky. You know we don't have the space. I let out a humorless laugh. Oh, so I have to sacrifice everything, but you don't even want to give up a guest room? It's different, she muttered. No, it's not, I shot back. You just don't want to deal with Daniel's mess. You never have. It's easier to dump him on me and pretend like you're being a good parent. She stammered, struggling to come up with an excuse. But we both knew the truth. She never planned to take him in. She just wanted to shove the responsibility onto me. I turned back to Daniel and Rachel, who were watching me with angry, expectant eyes. Take your stuff and go, I said firmly. Rachel let out another dramatic sob. You don't mean that. Yes, I said, pulling out my phone, I do. And if you don't leave right now, I'll call the police and have them remove you. Daniel's eyes widened. Are you serious? I held up my phone. Try me. For a moment, he just stood there, his whole body trembling with anger. Then, finally, he grabbed one of the moving boxes and threw it to the ground, sending baby clothes spilling onto the porch. You're gonna regret this, Mark, he shouted. One day you'll be alone in this house, and you'll wish you had family. I didn't flinch. I'll take my chances. With one last glare, he grabbed Rachel by the arm and stomped down the steps. She kept sobbing loudly, making a scene as they walked to their car. I stood there, watching as they drove away, disappearing into the night. For the first time in my life, I had said no, and meant it. I turned and walked inside, locking the door behind me. And as I stood in the quiet of my own home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. I knew there would be backlash. I just didn't expect it to explode so fast. The next morning, I woke up to my phone vibrating nonstop. Text after text flooded in. The family group chat had turned into a war zone. Mom, I cannot believe you did this to your own brother. You should be ashamed of yourself. Dad, we raised you better than this, Mark. Family is supposed to take care of each other. Aunt Linda, I don't blame Mark. Daniel has always been reckless with money. It's about time someone held him accountable. Uncle Mike, yeah, but throwing your own brother out, that's cold. He's about to be a father. Cousin Sarah, Mark worked for that house. Daniel had no right to just take it. Mom, this is not up for debate. Mark is heartless, and I don't know how he can live with himself. I groaned, rubbing my face. It was too early for this. I scrolled through the messages, watching as the family split into two sides, those who thought I was justified and those who thought I was the devil. One message, though, made me stop cold. It was from Daniel. Daniel, you'll be alone in that house forever. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around my phone. Enough. I went straight to his contact and hit block. No more angry messages, no more guilt tripping, no more of his nonsense. I took a deep breath and set my phone down. For the first time in a long time, I was putting myself first. The next few weeks were interesting. Daniel had officially gone on a smear campaign. Everywhere I went, family members were reaching out, repeating the same things he had told them. Mark kicked his own pregnant sister-in-law onto the streets. Mark only cares about money. Mark turned his back on his own nephew before he was even born. It was like he was painting me as some kind of heartless villain. I ignored most of it. Let them believe whatever they wanted. I wasn't going to waste my time trying to prove my side of the story. But then I started hearing things from mutual friends. Daniel wasn't just telling the family, I found out he was complaining to anyone who would listen. Apparently he was couch surfing, bouncing from one friend's place to another, acting like some tragic victim. Oh man, Mark just threw us out like we were nothing, he would say. Rachel cried all night. We don't know what we're going to do. Of course he left out the part where he tried to steal my house. A few of my friends even called me, checking in, just to make sure I was okay. Dude, Daniel is going around telling everyone you're some kind of greedy monster, my friend Jake said. I told him straight up, you tried to take his house, man. What did you expect, but he just plays the victim. I sighed. Yeah, sounds about right. He's embarrassing himself, Jake added. People see through it. The ones who actually know you anyway. That gave me some comfort. At least some people weren't buying his lies. But the people who did believe him? My parents. They refused to speak to me. No calls, no texts, nothing. At first, it bothered me. Even though I knew they were wrong, it still hurt that they cut me off so easily. But after a while, I started feeling something unexpected. Relief. For once in my life, I wasn't being dragged into Daniel's mess. For once, I wasn't being guilt-tripped into fixing his mistakes. For once, I was free. With all the family drama cut off, I finally had time to focus on myself. I started making improvements to the house, things I had put off for months. I upgraded my kitchen, fixed the backyard, even repainted a few rooms. It felt good to invest in something that was mine. Work was better too. Without constant stress from family drama, I was more focused, more productive. And best of all, I could actually relax. No random calls at night, no endless demands for help, just peace. One evening, I was sitting on my couch, enjoying the quiet, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my cousin Sarah. Sarah, hey, just thought you should know Daniel and Rachel moved back in with your parents. I stared at the message, reading it twice. Then I laughed. So after weeks of my parents telling me they didn't have space for Daniel, they took him in anyway? Unbelievable. But also, not my problem. I should have known my family wouldn't let it go. The morning after Daniel and Rachel tried to force their way into my house, I woke up to a storm of messages. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I groggily reached over, squinting at the screen. The family group chat was going crazy. It didn't take long to see why. Mom, I cannot believe you did this to your own brother. After everything we've done for you. Dad, Mark, you should be ashamed of yourself. Family comes first. You let us all down last night. Aunt Lisa, I don't see the problem. Mark worked for his house. Why should he have to give it away? Uncle Rob, yeah, but come on, kicking out your pregnant sister-in-law. That's extreme. Cousin Matt, Daniel should have known better than to think he could just take the house. Mark was right to stand his ground. Mom, stop defending him. We raised him better than this. Daniel, you're a selfish, greedy coward, Mark. Enjoy sitting in that big house all alone, because that's all you'll ever have. I stared at the screen, feeling a strange mix of frustration and amusement. Half the family thought I was a terrible person. The other half thought I was right. And Daniel? He had gone full victim mode. I scrolled through the messages, my eyes narrowing at Daniel's latest text, you'll be alone in that house forever. That was it. I clicked on his name. Block. Instant peace. I let out a slow breath, setting my phone down. For the first time in years, I didn't care what my family thought. I wasn't going to let them guilt-trip me into fixing Daniel's problems anymore. The lies start spreading over the next few weeks. I started hearing things. Daniel was couch surfing, bouncing from one friend's place to another, telling anyone who would listen about how his evil brother had abandoned him. He made sure to leave out the part where he tried to take my house. I ran into an old friend at the grocery store one evening. Dude, he said, shaking his head, Daniel's been telling everyone you kicked him and Rachel out onto the streets. I snorted. Figures. Did he tell you the part where he showed up with moving boxes and tried to force his way in? My friend's eyes widened. Wait, what? No. He made it sound like you just shut the door in his face while Rachel was crying. I let out a dry laugh. Yeah, that's because he wants to be the victim. My friend shook his head. Man, he really knows how to twist a story. Yeah, I said, grabbing a bag of chips off the shelf. But I don't care anymore. And I really didn't. Let Daniel talk. Let him tell whatever sob story he wanted. Anyone who actually knew me would see the truth. My parents pick aside the worst part? My parents completely cut me off. No calls. No texts. Nothing. It was like I didn't exist to them anymore. I tried once, just once, to call my mom a week after the argument. She didn't answer. A few minutes later, she texted me, "Don't call me again until you're ready to make things right." I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I deleted the message. I wasn't the one who needed to make things right. I wasn't the one who tried to take something that didn't belong to me. And if they couldn't see that, that was their problem. The unexpected feeling, I expected to feel guilty. I expected to feel miserable. After all, my entire life I had been told that family comes first. But as the days passed, I felt something else entirely. Relief. No more guilt-tripping calls. No more being expected to fix Daniel's mess. No more stress. For once, I was just living my life without being dragged into someone else's drama. I started focusing on my home. I had been putting off renovations for months. But now, I had the time. I upgraded the kitchen, fixed up the backyard, finally painted the guest room a color I actually liked. Every change I made reminded me of something important. This was mine. A house that I had worked for. A home that I had earned. And no one was going to take it from me. Daniel's reality, of course, Daniel wasn't doing so great. I didn't have to check in on him, other people did that for me. Every few days I'd hear from a friend or cousin about how Daniel was still couch surfing, complaining to anyone who would listen about how unfair life was. Apparently Rachel wasn't happy either. She's fed up, my cousin Matt told me one day. She thought they'd be settled in your house by now. Instead, they're hopping from one place to another. I laughed. Yeah, well, that's what happens when you expect a free ride. Daniel could whine all he wanted. But I was done playing the role of his safety net. The silence, a few more weeks passed. For the first time in a long time, my phone wasn't blowing up with drama. No one was calling to demand things from me. No one was expecting me to drop everything and fix someone else's mistakes. I had peace, and it felt amazing. I had always thought that standing up for myself would make me feel guilty, but instead, I felt free. Months passed, and life? It was peaceful. No more phone calls demanding that I be a good brother. No more guilt-tripping texts. No more drama. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I focused on my home, upgraded the kitchen, fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, even started a small garden in the backyard. I had finally taken control of my life, and honestly, it felt good. Then, one afternoon, everything changed with a single text. The message that made me laugh. I was in the middle of fixing a loose cabinet door when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my cousin Sarah. Sarah, hey, just thought you should know Daniel and Rachel moved back in with your parents. I blinked at the screen. Then I read it again. I actually laughed out loud because I couldn't believe it. So they had space after all? I had spent weeks listening to my parents say they didn't have room for Daniel. They didn't have the space. They didn't have the resources. It just wasn't possible for them to take him in. And now, Daniel and Rachel were living in their basement, rent-free. I shook my head, still laughing. It was so predictable. Of course they had space. They just didn't want to deal with him. Not if they could shove the responsibility onto me instead. But when I refused, they had no choice. And now they were stuck with him. They never told me. Wonder why? I texted Sarah back. Me? Wait, they never told me this. When did this happen? Sarah, a few weeks ago. I think they didn't want you to know. Of course they didn't. Because if I found out, it would prove that all their excuses, the guilt, the lectures, the emotional manipulation, had been a lie. They could have taken Daniel in from the start. But instead, they tried to push it on me. I should have been angry. But honestly, I just found it hilarious. Daniel's new life in the basement over the next few days, I started hearing more details. Daniel and Rachel weren't just staying with my parents, they had completely taken over the basement. They weren't paying rent. They weren't helping with bills. They weren't even helping around the house. They had no plans to leave. Apparently, Rachel had convinced my mom that she shouldn't have to stress during pregnancy, so my parents were doing everything for them. Cooking, cleaning, buying groceries. And Daniel? Still jobless. Still sitting around, playing the victim, complaining about how I had abandoned him. It was exactly what I expected. My parents' silence said everything, and my parents, they didn't reach out. Not once. No calls. No texts. No attempts to make me fix things. At first, I thought maybe they were waiting for me to call first. But after a while, I realized the truth. They weren't ignoring me because they were angry. They were ignoring me because they were embarrassed. Embarrassed that everything they said, their arguments, their excuses, had fallen apart. Embarrassed that they had no one to blame but themselves. Embarrassed because, deep down, they knew I had been right. Not my problem. I could have reached out. I could have said, "So how's living with Daniel going?" I could have rubbed it in. But I didn't, because I didn't care anymore. Daniel wasn't my responsibility. My parents' choices weren't my responsibility. None of it had anything to do with me anymore. I had my home, my life, my peace. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't being pulled into a mess I didn't create. My family had made their choice, and I had made mine. I wasn't looking back. I won. Not in the way you win a competition, but in the way that truly mattered. I was free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being dragged into Daniel's mess. I wasn't carrying the weight of my parents' expectations. I wasn't being told to sacrifice so my brother could have an easier life. I was finally living for myself, and it felt amazing. My life without the drama, with my family's chaos no longer hanging over me. I threw myself into things that actually mattered. My house? I made it even better. I repainted the walls, upgraded the flooring, and even transformed the guest room into a home office. Not because I needed the space, but because I could. I started working out more, eating healthier, and focusing on my career. Without the constant stress of family drama, my productivity skyrocketed. And the best part? The silence. No more 2 a.m. guilt-tripping calls from my parents. No more texts from Daniel demanding money or help. No more expectations to fix things that weren't my responsibility. For once, my home actually felt like what it was supposed to be, mine. The family tries to pretend nothing happened. It took a few months, but eventually my parents broke the silence. One evening, I was in the middle of making dinner when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. "Mom, hey sweetheart, we're having a family dinner this weekend. It's been so long. You should come." I stared at the message, almost laughing. No apology, no acknowledgement of what happened. Just a casual invitation like everything was normal. It was classic. In their minds, time had passed, so I was supposed to just forget everything. Forget that they had cut me off. Forget that they had tried to manipulate me into giving up my house. Forget that they chose to take Daniel's side and punish me for setting boundaries. No, I wasn't going back to that. I typed my response. Me, no thanks. I'm good. Simple. Direct. No explanation. A few minutes later, she responded. "Mom, are you seriously still holding on to this? It's been months." I sighed, shaking my head. They still didn't get it. I wasn't holding on to anything. I was just done. I didn't reply. And honestly, I didn't feel bad about it. What about Daniel? Daniel. He was exactly where I expected him to be. Still living in the basement. Still job hopping. Still blaming me for all his problems. Occasionally, I'd hear updates from cousins or family friends. Yeah, Daniel still hasn't found a steady job. He keeps saying the economy is bad. Rachel complains about how small the basement is, but she's not working either. Your parents are exhausted. They didn't expect Daniel to stay this long. Of course they didn't. They thought he'd get his life together once he moved in. They thought he'd take responsibility once he had no other choice. But Daniel had never changed before. Why would he start now? The final truth, looking back, everything that happened taught me something important. For years, I had been raised to believe that family comes first. But what my parents really meant was Daniel comes first. I was just there to clean up his mess, to take responsibility for his mistakes, to make his life easier at the expense of my own. But now I knew the truth. I didn't owe Daniel anything. I wasn't responsible for fixing his life. I wasn't obligated to give up my home, my peace, or my future for him. And if my parents wanted to keep enabling him, that was on them. But me? I was done. And most importantly, my house, it was mine, and always would be.